Perfect. All right, welcome everybody to the Project Edge Customer Insights Study final webinar. Thank you all for attending this session today. We're very lucky to have Associate Professor Josh Newton from Deakin University's Better Consumption Lab to walk us through the longitudinal customer insight study that's been conducted on behalf of Project Edge. Please note this session will be recorded and we'll make sure that the presentation and the webinar recording will be available by the end of the week. And also note that all pieces of our customer insight study are also now available by the Project Edge website. So thank you again for attending. We really appreciate your time, and I'll hand it over to Josh to kind of walk through this really big piece of work that we're incredibly proud of. So thank you, Josh. And if you could all please go on mute, and if you have any questions, please just use the chat function or the raise hand function, and we'll get to that as the webinar goes on. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thanks, Rachel. So as Rachel mentioned, my name is Josh Newton from Deakin University, and really excited to present to you all a bit of a snapshot of some of the key emergent findings that have emerged from what is a relatively extensive piece of customer insights research. So I'll step you through those in a couple of moments. But before we do, I'd just like to do a brief acknowledgement of country. This beautiful picture is taken just a couple of kilometres away from where I'm currently presenting from, on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of all the various lands on which we are dialing into this webinar, and to pay our respects to leaders past, present and emerging. As Rachel mentioned, we are recording this session, and we will also have an opportunity for questions and answers at the very end of the webinar. Unfortunately, I can't pay attention to the chat function as I'm presenting, but very happy to answer any questions that people have live at the very end of the session, or alternatively, if you put it into the chat function, I'll also get to that at the end of the session. So first of all, a little bit of background. I think probably most of you who have dialed into the webinar are familiar with Project Edge, but just in case you aren't, I just wanted to give a very brief overview. As probably most of us appreciate, distributed energy resources, or DER, have, I think, a pretty transformational, or the potential to be a transformational technology within the Australian marketplace, particularly as we're looking to try and achieve broader renewable targets that the government has set for Australia. The real challenge, however, is how we can actually orchestrate these DER so that they can start to deliver broader wholesale network support services. And that's where Project Edge really came in, to be a proof of concept DER marketplace, to really demonstrate both the technical elements, but also to start getting an insight into some of the customer related issues that might be associated with these new forms of services. So Project Edge itself was a trial that occurred on the AusNet distribution network in Victoria and involved 3 DER aggregators: Discover Energy, Mondo and Ream. And some of the research that I'll be going through will be looking at customers of those 3 aggregators, hence why it's important to call them out right from the outset. So the broad aim of the customer insights research that we were looking at was to, in the first instance, start to understand what would be required to develop up virtual power plants, or VPPs, that would be attractive to customers. We obviously see VPPs as being important to oversee that orchestration of DER, but the orchestration potential that VPPs can deliver ultimately requires customers to have signed up and to have joined a VPP. So what do we need to do to really make sure that VPPs are an attractive value proposition that customers will be wanting to sign up to? And then once they have started to sign up to a VPP, what do we need to do to ensure that customers are satisfied with the services they are experiencing and are likely to remain with their VPP longer term? We were also interested in better understanding and unpacking issues of trust around having an aggregator managing customers' DER, and in particular what we could do to start to increase a customer's potential trust in an aggregator looking after their DER. What could be done to encourage additional VPP export activity? And stepping back slightly, what would be policies that might help to fairly facilitate DER exports? So these were some of the high-level research aims that were guiding much of the customer research that we were doing. So as a little bit of a visual schematic for some of the research that we've done, I've presented this little overview up on the screen, and you can see that there are a number of key research reports that we have delivered. The slides for the webinar will be circulated after the session, and you'll see that each of those reports have been linked to the slides. So if you are interested in the literature that we've done or in some of the surveys that we've done of potential customers or of current customers, there are links not only on this page, but throughout the presentation as well, so that you can start to delve into some of the underpinning research for any of the summaries that I'm presenting. But ultimately, there was a foundational piece of work, the literature review that we undertook. And the aim of the literature review is to really understand, out of the existing body of research that exists, what are some of the research gaps that are remaining? What are the things that we need to better understand to really try to address some of those broader key research aims that I was talking to just a few moments ago? And these are some of the research gaps that we identified through this literature review. The first one, and this is one that I think is shared by many of the people in aggregators that I've been chatting with over the last year or two, is a real overemphasis on early adopters. Now, obviously, that is going to be a pretty natural thing to be associated with new technologies. The adoption status of any form of technology will only expand as more people start to adopt that technology, hence why early adopters have been the focus of much of the research that has taken place. But the challenge with having this overemphasis on early adopters is that we don't necessarily understand what other segments within the population might start to think about VPPs, which really makes it more difficult for us to understand ways of being able to package up VPPs in ways that will be attractive to members of the broader population. Some of the other research gaps that we identified through this literature review included things like having a deeper understanding of what customers were actually expecting and what they were actually desiring for the financial returns associated with their VPP participation. How do we look to resolve that potential tension between, on the one hand, customers wanting to customize their service experience, and on the other hand, making sure that it is as easy for them to use as possible? What do we need to do to better understand how DERs and VPPs compare with other energy products that customers either might be considering or of which they have actually currently signed up to? And then getting some further information about what do we need to do to best communicate with customers so that they've got the information that they need to make a decision as to whether to join a VPP, as well as also what we would need to do to enhance trust in the aggregator and to reduce their risk perceptions about their participation. And then finally, what do we need to do to really develop relational interactions with aggregators as opposed to transactional relationships, which don't necessarily lay that firm foundation for ongoing satisfied customers and ongoing customer retention? And so much of the work that we did was designed to address these particular research gaps. And you'll see many of the things that I was just talking to come up across the slides that I'll be going through over the next few minutes. But first of all, into the results themselves. And what I've done is separated this webinar into two broad customer cohorts. The first is potential customers, and then the second, which I'll get to in a few minutes' time, is looking at the results that we identified from current customers of the Project Edge VPPs. So in terms of the potential customers, there were two broad pieces of research that we did. The first was a survey of almost 400 regional Victorians, and then a second survey of almost 900 Australians across the NEM jurisdictions, except for Victoria. Obviously, given that we've just surveyed a Victorian sample, this was looking at a broader cohort, but minus Victorians. Sort of really high level, what were customers thinking about a VPP? I think it's important to preface my discussion on this slide with the fact that the overwhelming majority of customers were not aware of what a virtual power plant was or had either heard of the term but didn't know anything about it. We were talking about more than 90% of surveyed customers or potential customers falling into that particular category. So what we did is we presented customers with a very brief overview of what a virtual power plant was. And after reading that very short summary, we had almost 2/3 of customers indicating that they were either somewhat or extremely positive about VPPs. In other words, we had a lot of people having very favourable and positive opinions about a virtual power plant. Now, this positive opinion didn't automatically translate, however, into interest in joining a virtual power plant. We can see up here on the screen that we only had about a quarter of participants who indicated that they were either very or extremely interested in joining. Most customers were either not at all interested or only slightly interested. And I think that this presents an interesting dilemma. We've got customers that are potentially favorably predisposed to the concept of a VPP, without necessarily having firm commitments or firm interest in looking to join a VPP. And that potential tension is something that we'll return to a number of times over the slides ahead. Now, this particular graph, there's a lot happening. And so I'm going to first of all explain what this is and then start to unpack what the implications are for better understanding what it is that potential customers are wanting from both DERs and also from virtual power plants. So the very first segments, the light blue columns in this graph, refer to the importance of 6 outcomes that we're asking customers to evaluate. We're asking them to evaluate how important is it of achieving these broader goals of saving money, of receiving a reliable supply of power, reducing CO2 emissions, helping the community, reducing life admin, and receiving good service. And what we found is that there were 3 goal outcomes that were particularly important for customers. And they probably won't be a surprise to most of you on the call. Saving money, reliable supply of power, and receiving good service. They were the 3 most important outcomes of the 6 that we're looking at that customers were looking to achieve. What we then did is we asked customers to evaluate those 6 outcomes against not only their current power arrangements, whatever they might be, but also against DER and joining up to a VPP or an energy aggregator. And they are the other 3 segments that we've got in terms of these columns. So the grey column represents current power arrangements, the orange yellow segment represents signing up to and joining, adopting DER, and that tealy green color represents joining an energy aggregator. And what we found here is that on the 3 most important outcomes that matter to customers, DERs and VPPs were seen as helping to achieve only one more so than their current power arrangements, and that was saving money. So in other words, relative to whatever their current power arrangements were, adopting DER and joining a VPP was seen as being more likely to deliver elements of saving money. For the other 2 outcomes that were most important to customers, so receiving reliable supply of power and receiving good service, current power arrangements were seen as being more likely to deliver those outcomes relative to adopting DER and joining a VPP. So broadly speaking, what this really suggests is that when customers are looking at DER and VPP adoption, they're really seeing it as being more likely to achieve monetary financial savings relative to their current power arrangements. That's the thing that was really resonating with customers. We then had a look at predictors of customers' interest in adopting both DER and VPP, and we found 2 very significant drivers of that interest: saving money, as we were just talking about on the previous slide, and also receiving a reliable supply of power. In other words, customers who were seeing DER and VPP as being more likely to help them save money and more likely to help them receive a reliable supply of power responded far more strongly in terms of their interest and desire to either adopt DER or to join VPP. So again, that financial element is very much coming through as being a core driver of interest in VPP adoption, as is receiving a reliable supply of power. So given that we've got this very strong signal coming through from potential customers about financial expectations, what was it exactly that they were looking for in terms of the desired annual savings for joining a VPP, as well as for adopting various forms of DER? And that's what's presented up here on the screen. I've parceled it out into 2 slightly different subsections: customers who don't currently have solar PV and customers who currently do have solar PV. Because obviously, if you've got solar PV, you're not going to have an interest in installing additional solar panels. What we can see here is that the desired annual savings from joining a VPP in particular were very high in terms of those expectations. Customers were expecting to receive on average, or wanting to receive on average, $1,000 worth of savings as a result of joining a VPP. Now, they are very high expectations, and expectations that are probably not going to be possible to deliver at the moment. And so I think the broader implication of this is really needing to first of all understand that this is where customers are currently situated in terms of their expectations about what the financial benefits of joining a VPP start to look like, but also then signaling that there's going to need to be some expectation management to help customers better appreciate what is possible financially from joining a VPP and what may not be possible in terms of joining a VPP. So what were some of the other views that potential customers had about joining a VPP and adopting DER? This is returning back to that broader graph that I showed a few slides ago, although with a slightly different element that I'm emphasizing here. And this is looking at the likelihood of VPPs and DERs being able to achieve those 6 core goals that customers were interested in looking to achieve. And what we can see here is that customers were seeing VPPs and DER as broadly being equivalent in terms of the likelihood of being able to achieve certain types of these goal outcomes. In other words, if you were to if you were to have adopted DER, the likelihood of VPP being able to deliver additional benefits over and above your DER participation, customers weren't really seeing that really coming through for any of those core outcomes, with one exception, helping the community. When they were asked to evaluate the likelihood that VPPs and DER would deliver benefits to the community, the VPP was seen as being able to deliver greater benefits to the community relative to the adoption of DER. So broadly, what this really starts to demonstrate is that with the exception of that particular goal outcome, customers couldn't really see a clear benefit in joining a VPP over and above adopting DER. We also ask customers to evaluate DER and VPPs as to whether they would deliver rational outcomes, such as whether they would be perceived as being useful, or whether they would deliver emotional outcomes, such as whether they would be perceived as being exciting. The reason for doing this is that much of the marketing literature really talks to the importance of having that emotional connection with products and services. The greater that emotional connection, the stronger the likelihood is that customers will be interested in both adopting and remaining with certain products or services. Hence why it's important to really try to understand that mix between the rational and the emotional. Certainly in terms of the potential customers that we surveyed, most were seeing the prospect of adopting DER and joining VPPs as delivering far more rational outcomes as opposed to emotional outcomes. In other words, they were seeing it as being more likely to be useful as opposed to being exciting. Now, this isn't to say that this can't shift, and it certainly could be an element of emphasis for future branding related exercises, but I think it really helps to situate and explain where customers are approaching these two different forms of technology and how that broadly evaluating those elements and those potential benefits that they can start to achieve. We also ask customers to look at and to evaluate potential barriers to joining a VPP to really understand what it was that might hold back their VPP adoption decisions. And probably something that wouldn't be of a surprise of most of us on the call, the cost of purchasing the DER necessary to gain access to the VPP was far and away seen to be the biggest perceived barrier to joining a VPP. The other elements that were also seen as being important barriers were the installation process of having either a battery or solar PV installed on the household, and then also giving companies access to the battery asset or to the DER asset more broadly. Which is a really good segue to this next subsection that I'll be talking to, which is about how can we build trust. When we asked customers to what extent they could trust an aggregator to export power on their behalf, we had a quarter of participants saying that they could indeed trust the aggregator to have that broader management of the DER and to export power on their behalf, and 15% who were saying that no, they wouldn't be able to trust an aggregator to act on their behalf. Overwhelmingly, though, we had almost 2/3 of customers who were saying that they were not sure as to whether they could trust an aggregator to act on their behalf with respect to DER exports, really indicating that a large proportion of potential customers are reserving judgment about whether aggregators can be trusted. So what we then asked is what would potentially help to increase their trust in the aggregator? And there was a whole range of different strategies or tactics that we presented to customers. I've only put the most strongly endorsed ones up here on the screen. If you're interested in looking at the broader set of potential strategies, I encourage you to look at the link through here to look at those broader findings. But we had, broadly speaking, customers who were wanting greater control over the aggregation process and also greater transparency as to when exports were likely to take place, as well as also guarantees around earnings. Broadly speaking, these were the tactics, the strategies that customers were identifying as being particularly helpful in enhancing their trust in an aggregator. Some of these may not be as easily amenable to implementation, notifying customers every single time an export is about to take place might be potentially overwhelming for customers if they're receiving large numbers of notifications. And I think the big caveat to have is that these are results coming from potential customers, not from those that have had direct experience or exposure to an aggregator. But nevertheless, I think the broader implication is issues of transparency, issues of control were seen as being helpful for really delivering greater potential trust in an aggregator. We also asked customers to look at and to evaluate potential types of information that would help them make a decision as to whether or not they would ultimately choose to join an aggregator. And looking across the various forms of information that we were asking customers to evaluate, there were a couple of broader meta implications that I think are useful to touch upon. First, customers are very desirous of understanding the financial benefits associated with their VPP participation, very much echoing and triangulating with those early findings that I was talking to about the fact that the financial benefits were really key in helping customers be interested in joining a VPP in the first place. By extension, they're also wanting to have clarity as to the amount of money that they could expect to make as a result of their VPP participation. They were also looking for information about consumer safeguards, though. For example, how would their battery be protected as a result of having an external party, a third party, come in and trade energy from that battery on their behalf? They were also wanting to have greater assurances about how things like their privacy would be protected, really wanting to make sure that there were strong and firm safeguards around those types of elements. Over the next few slides, I'm going to now focus on a couple of subsegments to really get a better picture of who within the broader community is most interested in either the adoption of DER or in the joining of the VPP. And the first customer segment that I'll be presenting and talking to is around solar PV status. So in other words, whether customers do versus don't currently have solar PV. From a VPP adoption decision, there wasn't any significant difference between this customer segment. So between those with and without solar PV, it didn't have a broad impact upon their stated intention or interest in joining a VPP, should they have their DER that would make that a possibility. From a DER adoption perspective, those who had solar PV were far more likely or far more interested in adopting a battery than those without solar PV were in adopting both solar panels and a battery. And I think it speaks to probably a couple of potential reasons for that difference. The first being that those who have installed solar PV have already taken one step towards adoption, and they've already paid some or often a relatively significant amount of money to actually install solar PVs. And so by extension, the overall cost of installing additional DER, such as the battery, would be less than for those who are looking at doing all of that at once. That could certainly be a possibility. Another one, though, is that those who have solar PV might better appreciate the benefits that DER could bring to their household and to their financial bills than those who haven't actually tangibly experienced the benefits of solar PV. And so that might also be underpinning some of these differences as well. We were also interested in understanding the socio-demographic profile of customers who were interested in either adopting DER or joining a VPP. And what we can see here is that there's a set of socio-demographic variables that were broadly predictive of at least interest in adopting DER or in joining a VPP, and sometimes both. And these are the ones that we found as being significant. There were a whole range of other things that we were looking at which weren't significant, but really thought these are the ones that are of most interest. So broadly speaking, customers who are younger, who are university educated, who are middle income households and in larger households, so 3 or more household occupants, as well as those who indicated being politically progressive, all of these are factors that were identified as predicting interest in either adopting DER or in joining a VPP. Now, the other element that we were very interested in looking at, as I was presaging right at the very start of this webinar, was looking at different adopter categories and really trying to understand what do people outside the early adopter category, what are they thinking about VPPs? What's really shaping their interest and what's their broad desire around this technology, around issues of trust, etc. Before delving into the results itself, just taking a quick step back to actually explain the adopter categories that we were looking at. So the first of those categories was innovators and early adopters. And these are people who tend to be interested in being, if not the first, then certainly a leader in trying out new energy technologies. These are people that if a new energy technology comes out, they're going to be interested in trying it, often just for the sake of it being relatively new. The early majority represented the bulk of our customers, 53% of our surveyed potential customers. And these were people who indicated that they wanted to hear about other people's experiences before wanting to try those new energy technologies themselves. The late majority made up about a quarter of our potential customer cohort, and these are customers who were indicating that they would only try new energy technologies if the people around them that they trusted had already done so. So very much a greater degree of caution. They were adopting more of that suck and see approach, wanting to make sure that the people that they trusted had already been satisfied with those new energy technologies before being interested in adopting it themselves. And then finally, we have the laggard cohort who were not interested, broadly speaking, in adopting new energy technologies, and they made up about 11% of our cohort. So if we have a look at their interest in either adopting DER or in joining a VPP, we can see that the innovators and early adopters and the early majority, broadly speaking, were most interested in both DER adoption and VPP adoption. Not necessarily too unsurprising given what they actually represent, but I think it's useful to indicate that the early majority could not be statistically significantly varied or differentiated from the innovators and early adopters in terms of their interest in adopting both DER and VPPs. They're really demonstrating that the early majority are certainly interested in looking at these types of technologies and might be very useful broader customer segments to start understanding how to actually pitch VPPs and DER adoption to them with a view of being able to broaden out the participation base for VPPs. That being said, there were some important differences across the adopter categories in terms of issues like trust. So the early majority, for example, were significantly more likely to indicate being unsure about whether they could trust an aggregator to manage their DER assets on their behalf. The innovators and early adopters, by contrast, were significantly more likely to indicate that they were willing to trust aggregators, and laggards were significantly more likely to indicate that no, they wouldn't be able to trust aggregators to manage their DER on their behalf. So what are some of the things that might help to really increase the trust of the early majority in particular? So these are some of the techniques that could potentially be useful. And these will echo some of what I was talking to a few slides before, but really with a different snapshot here around how the different adopter categories are really resonating or not resonating with these particular techniques. As we can see, the guaranteed earnings and issues of control were very much things that were more likely to resonate with the early majority relative to those other adopter categories. This is something I think that is obviously going to be of particular interest as we look to expand the participation for VPPs outside of just that little early adopter group towards the early majority group as well. There are some others also, though, that I think are also interested to really zero in on, and that's around the broader issues of referrers or of people that you know. Friends and family having joined the aggregator really resonated with the late majority, which is not surprising given that the late majority are really looking to people around them before they will decide to sign up to new technologies. But also having an aggregator endorsed by a trusted community group was something that particularly resonated with the early majority, particularly relative to the laggard cohort. So these would be other elements that might be of potential interest, really with a view of being able to enhance trust in an aggregator. We also looked at what would be seen as fair DER export policies. And again, a little bit of background because it's helpful to understand the scenarios that we put to customers before going through the results themselves. So the first thing that we did is used a metaphor to really help explain these policy scenarios, understanding that a lot of consumers aren't necessarily engaging with day-to-day issues with the national electricity market or with some of the challenges that might be situated with increasing DER export amounts. And so really trying to have a metaphor that would be able to balance out people with varying levels of information and knowledge about these broader challenges. And the metaphor that we used was equating transmission lines to big pipes and distribution lines to small pipes. And really with a view that if we're wanting to have this safety and the stability of the grid to be maintained, it's really important that the capacity of those pipes is not exceeded. We then presented customers with 4 different scenarios describing different export policy options. The first of these was almost a status quo type scenario. There were no upgrades to small pipe capacity, and by extension, this would mean that prices would slowly inch up over time, just by virtue of not being able to draw upon to the same extent the DER export capacity that households are increasingly installing across the country. The second scenario was that there would be no upgrades to small pipe capacity, but that dynamic export limits would start to be introduced so that customers would be able to export more during periods of low supply, but they might have limits to the amount of energy that they could export to the grid when there were issues of having an oversupply of energy. The last 2 scenarios were looking at upgrades to small pipe capacity. So in other words, upgrades to distribution capacity. The scenario 3, however, those upgrade costs were borne by all consumers, whereas in scenario 4, the upgrade costs were borne only by consumers who had exporting DER. So in terms of the results that we found, ultimately, a fair policy was one that delivered the greatest benefits to one's own household. It's sometimes lovely to think that people would be able to have broader understandings or perceptions of fairness that didn't necessarily implicate their own lived experience for their own household. But broadly speaking, when people were evaluating the fairness of these policies, very much those that delivered the greatest benefits to their own household were seen as more likely to be fair. For example, scenario 3, which would be having the costs of costs of distribution capacities to be borne by all customers. Customers who didn't have solar panels saw that it's been significantly less fair than those who had solar panels. In contrast, scenario 4, where the costs would be shared only by those who have DER exporting capacity, those that didn't have solar panels saw that it's been significantly more fair than those who had purchased solar panels. The scenario that was seen as most fair, or where there wasn't a difference between those 2 cohorts, was scenario 2. And this was the scenario which was talking about no costly upgrades to distribution capacity, but where there was the introduction of variable export limits. So that was a brief overview of some of the headline findings and results from our potential customer cohort. I'm now going to focus upon a different cohort, those who were current customers of the Project Edge VPPs, really to get a deeper dive into their experiences with the Project Edge VPPs, as well as also some of the learnings emerging from those experiences. So the work that I'll be talking to drew upon a set of interviews that we did with 35 customers, as well as a survey that we undertook with 65 customers. And all of these, as I mentioned, were current customers of the 3 VPPs associated with Project Edge. So how satisfied, broadly speaking, were these customers with those VPPs? Broadly speaking, overall satisfaction was strong. We saw, for example, that 79% of customers either agreed or strongly agreed that they were satisfied with their VPP experience, which on the face of it is a very strong figure, particularly given that this was a field trial. This was something which was very much presented as being a broader set of learnings, a trial to really unpack and understand the technology associated with VPPs and to make sure that it was able to achieve everything that it would need to achieve from a technology perspective. So having 79% satisfaction is a very strong number. The reason why I've got up on the top of the slide, though, the fact that overall satisfaction was fragile, is that when we asked customers to evaluate their VPP and the competitiveness of their VPP relative to others, we had 2/3 of customers not being able to make that particular evaluation. What this means is that as more VPPs start to come into the market and as more metrics start to become available so that customers start to be able to more effectively evaluate their VPP experience relative to those of others, we might start to see that broader satisfaction shift, potentially up or potentially down, just depending upon what it is that starts to happen over time. But certainly the element of VPP competitiveness and not being able to understand how their VPP experience stacks up with those of others means that there is a potential degree of fragility associated with those satisfaction evaluations. The other element worth drawing attention to is customers' comfort with the aggregator managing the DER on their behalf. This is obviously a foundational part of a VPP. A VPP isn't really possible if you're not having an aggregator actively managing your DER. And so the fact that we've got about 59% of customers who were indicating that they were very or extremely comfortable is good, but it also means that we've got a pretty sizable cohort who were indicating that they were either not at all comfortable, slightly comfortable, or somewhat comfortable. So again, something that will need to be a potential emphasis moving forward for ways of being able to increase those comfort levels so that as we start to expand out to broader segments of the population, we're likely to have customers who are satisfied and likely to remain with their VPP over time. And I'll talk to, in a few slides' time, some of the different things that these customers were indicating would potentially have increased their comfort levels with the VPPs, because I think these provide some important insights moving forward for how to actually increase that sense of comfort. In terms of who these customers were, 56% of the customers had purchased DER as part of joining the VPP. So that's a relatively sizable number, but it also means that we've got also a relatively sizable number of customers who were bringing pre-existing DER to the VPP. We also had the overwhelming majority of customers who had been with the VPP for at least 3 months. And so this is useful for making sure that their evaluations have been based on their own lived experience, as opposed to having customers who had potentially only just joined in the previous week and may not necessarily have had sufficient time to better understand some of the ins and outs of their VPP experience. In terms of the sociodemographic profile of current customers, we had approximately, we'll focus on age in the first instance. So we've got 59% of customers aged 60 years or above, which is substantially higher than that of the broader Australian population, where there's about 23% of Australians who are aged 60 years or above. We also have a very highly educated cohort of people who had signed up to join the VPPs. 43%, for example, indicated that they had had postgraduate qualifications versus 12% of Australians. And if you start to look at the broader proportion who are indicating that they had had tertiary qualifications, we're talking about 3/4 of current customers indicating tertiary qualifications, which is substantially higher than that of the Australian broader population. In terms of the number of occupants in their household, there was an overrepresentation of people with 2 occupants in their household and an underrepresentation of people living by themselves. And so if we have a look at all of these things in totality, what this pretty much suggests is that by and large, a pretty substantial proportion of customers were empty nesters who were probably either retirees or semi-retired and who had very substantial levels of education, just to paint out a little bit of a picture of who these customers were. It's also interesting to start looking at some of the reasons mentioned by customers for why they had decided to both adopt DER and to join a VPP, as well as also some of the potential barriers that they recognised could potentially provide headwinds for either the adoption of DER or the joining of a VPP. Now, financial benefits, no surprise, were certainly recognised as being of importance for motivating either DER adoption or the joining of a VPP, but so too were issues of energy independence and energy resilience. These were customers who were recognising that there were some benefits of being able to have resilience in their power supply, or alternatively, to be able to be more self-dependent on their energy production, as opposed to needing to draw down on all of this energy directly from the grid. Environmental benefits were also coming through as being very important for a very sizable proportion of the people who had signed up to join the VPPs. That we're talking particularly about recognising VPPs as being a way of offsetting the need for new development of potentially fossil fuel and or fossil fuel powered fire plants and CO2 emitting power generation. And so the ability to have their own personally purchased DER assets providing broader benefits to the grid and to be able to offset the need for more CO2 emitting power supplies was seen as being a very tangible benefit that resonated for a sizable cohort of customers. Many of the customers were also really attracted to the element of being able to support domestic innovation, particularly domestic innovation as it related to environmental benefits. Many were seeing this as a way of being able to help deliver and to help support the development of a new technology that would be really foundational to achieving broader environmental outcomes. And so some of these customers were going, look, the financial benefits for adoption will potentially happen at some stage in the future. They may not have happened now though, but I'm still prepared to sign up and to join this trial because I really want to help support the development of this technology that I see as being so important for helping benefit the community and helping to benefit the environment. Peace of mind was something that some customers were also mentioning as being important. They were recognizing that with greater costs and with potential issues around power blackouts, that having the peace of mind, broadly speaking, to be able to disconnect at least to some degree from those potential factors was something that would be of interest, of desire, particularly for the adoption of DER. And then the final one, and one that I'll talk to right at the very end of this webinar, is around bundling. And that's that for some customers, they were going, I don't really understand a huge amount of energy technologies. It's very complex. All I want is something that bundled together would deliver an attractive value proposition to me and will help me to deliver upon my energy needs or on other potential needs. And with that in mind, I've actually joined up to the VPP, less because of the VPP and more because it was bundled with a broader, interesting, attractive set of products or services. In terms of the potential barriers to the adoption of DER and the joining of VPP, these were, and I'll put this right at the very front of the caveat, these hadn't stopped these customers from obviously joining. We were only talking to customers in this instance who had joined the VPP, but nevertheless, they were recognizing these as being potential headwinds that could affect other customers and their evaluation and adoption decisions. The first was around unfair financial returns, and they were seeing in particular issues around feed-in tariffs and what it would look like for having some of their energy go back out to the grid versus how much it was taking from a personal finance perspective to install DER, seeing that balance as being unbalanced in their favour. They also were concerned about not having sufficient stored energy to be available for their own home use. And also some were mentioning concerns about data privacy and data security, particularly on the back of some fairly widely publicised data breaches that had happened a couple of months or in the months leading up to us undertaking these interviews. So very much those issues around data privacy and data security were top of mind for some of those customers. This, I think, is really drawing down further into that bundling issue and the fact that some customers were not especially into the weeds around energy. They were not deeply invested around different forms of energy technology. By and large, they were looking for something that would be able to deliver an attractive integrated service. And if that attractive integrated service potentially had a VPP attached to it, then that might start to drive the adoption of VPPs. And I think that this really provides an interesting strategic choice for aggregators that they might look to pursue moving forward, whether to have VPPs as a standalone service, and then by extension needing to make sure that that's seen as being an incredibly attractive service relative to just having a DER by itself, or alternatively, whether a VPP might be bundled up with other related services that in aggregate are seen as being incredibly attractive to customers. The other element that is important to draw out is the need to actively manage customer expectations so that what they ultimately experience will align with what they thought they would experience before adopting the VPP or the DER. We've got a few different indicative examples just to paint this out in a little bit more detail. Some customers, for example, had very unrealistic expectations about what their DER could achieve or how it would interact with the VPP. Some customers, for example, were seeing their DER as being able to provide complete assurance and complete stability of their power supply in the event of a power blackout, without realizing that there were limits to how much their battery would be able to discharge in terms of current to be able to support some of those household appliances. And so when a power blackout came about and they realized that they couldn't turn on all their household appliances as they were expecting, was something that was a degree of consternation for some of those customers who were sort of looking at what their lived experience had been relative to their expectations prior to joining or prior to adopting DER. Some customers also mentioned that they were hoping for the VPP to deliver more distinct and more direct benefits to their community than were actually achieved. They were looking in particular at trying to have some of the flow-on benefits emerging from the VPP, helping to be targeted towards very specific subsegments of the community, such as, for example, retirees, the elderly, people who were vulnerable, and really wanting to have those particular cohorts preferentially benefit from the power that they were sending back to the grid through their exports. And when they realized that that wasn't necessarily being achieved to the extent that they thought, we're really starting to see a potential discrepancy between what their initial expectations for joining had been relative to what the actual experience was. So what did customers ultimately experience? By and large, customer service was evaluated and perceived by customers as being good, but there were also opportunities for improvement. For example, most customers saw the aggregator that they were a part of as being reliable and trustworthy. We had 86% of customers either agreeing or strongly agreeing that their aggregator was reliable and trustworthy. We also had very high proportions indicating that the aggregator knew what they were doing and that they were easy to contact. Where there was a lower degree of endorsement was around the extent to which the aggregator was seen as looking after their long-term needs. We had 57% of customers who were agreeing or strongly agreeing to this particular subdimension of service. And it really speaks to the fact that the value proposition for joining an aggregator really does need to be sharpened up, even among those who have already made that decision to join the aggregator. And I'll talk to those elements momentarily. Some customers were also keen to customize their VPP settings, that the option was available to do so. But that was a relatively small proportion of the overall customer base, certainly that we interviewed. And these were customers, those who were wanting to customize were typically very technologically literate or energy literate. They were the people who were talking about comparing the settings and comparing the information coming from different apps that they had and putting it into Excel spreadsheets and really trying to delve into the weeds, delving into the data. For them, they were really enjoying the prospect of being able to customize their VPP settings. Most customers, however, were indicating a strong preference for VPP activities to be automated. There's a couple of interesting implications arising from this, though, and one of those is that as a result of this preference, the VPP would often remain a black box to those customers, and they weren't always aware of when or even if their DER active was being actively managed. And I think that this speaks to not only an issue around the potential black box, but also what might be necessary to overcome said black box in terms of the level of information required to both try to keep it automated on the one hand, while at the same time providing sufficient transparency for customers so they were more actively aware of when their DER assets were being managed. Delving a little bit further into some of those communication and transparency related issues, of the customers who record receiving any form of communication from their VPP, 51% indicated that they were satisfied with those communications. And we then asked customers in the survey through an open-ended response box, what would be some suggestions for how to improve the communication? Broadly speaking, what were they looking for to have been different, and that would have helped increase their satisfaction with those communications? There were three tangible things that were consistently coming through those open-ended responses. The first is to have greater awareness of the real-time impact of VPP activity. In other words, they wanted to understand not only when their DER assets were being utilized, but also why those DER assets were being utilized, very much with a view of helping to have greater transparency, greater knowledge of how their DER assets were being used. Some customers were also wanting, to the extent that it would be possible, forewarning of future planned VPP activities. And this was particularly motivated by a desire to make sure that if you were about to put on your washing machine or you're about to put on your dishwasher, that you knew that you would be able to draw upon self-consumption. You'd be able to draw upon the energy that you were being self-generating, as opposed to potentially drawing upon the grid because your DER assets were no longer helping or being available for self-consumption purposes. And then the final set of communication that customers were looking for was information about the learnings emerging from the Project Edge trial, very much reinforcing that earlier insight I spoke to, that a proportion of customers were particularly interested and motivated in joining the Project Edge VPPs because of the prospect of being able to further this technology, being able to help develop it more. Now, interestingly, in a separate question, we also asked customers, what would have enhanced your confidence in the aggregator managing your DER? And these three same factors also emerged. So I think it really speaks to the fact that as we can start to provide customers with greater communication, outlining the transparency with which their VPP assets are being used, and also situating that within a broader context, then so too will their trust and their confidence in the aggregator managing their DER on their behalf, so too will that start to increase. We also had some customers indicating that joining had been a leap of faith. They really understood that there were some broader benefits, particularly some of those broader intangible benefits associated with their joining, but that at the end of the day, they were wanting to have far greater information about the financial implications associated with their participation and hadn't actually been able to receive that information prior to their joining. And this is obviously a bit of a chicken and an egg situation. How do you find ways of being able to communicate this type of information to customers in ways that will start to allay some of their concerns, while at the same time not necessarily having access to all of the data that would be necessary to start undertaking those types of projections? Nevertheless, this is, I think, something that really does speak to a broader challenge for being able to motivate additional adoption of VPPs. Given the financial factors, given how important they are for being able to drive adoption, and given among potential customers that they are looking for as much assurance as possible about the financials that they will start to receive as a result of their for joining the VPP, it becomes really important that we can start to paint that financial picture so that they can understand what the cost implications will be for themselves and for their household. We then started to ask customers who shared the benefits associated with their VPP participation. And the first part is around the financial rewards that they received as a result of their participation. Now, there were a number of different financial rewards that the aggregators were providing to their customers. For some, it was subsidized DER purchasing. For some, it was broader vouchers that would be received as a result of their participation, and for some it were the financial benefits emerging from exporting of power to the grid. So there is a degree of diversity in terms of the financial rewards that customers were receiving. Despite that, 71% indicated that they were either somewhat or very satisfied with the financial rewards associated with their VPP participation. But at the same time, 30% also indicated that they were unsure what the financial impact had been of their VPP participation. And I think that this is an interesting sort of tension here, in the sense that we've got relatively good satisfaction or high satisfaction levels with the financial rewards. But when we started to delve into what impact the VPP participation had been on their actual energy bills, only a relatively small proportion had indicated that there had been a tangible decrease, with some saying that they were unsure, some saying that it was neutral, and some saying that it was increasing. And I think the broader meta implication here is that it's important moving forward that as VPPs start to mature and as they start to roll out to broader sections of the community, to really make sure that there's that clear connection between what the VPP participation looks like, both in terms of DER asset utilization, but then also how that is translated into financial benefits for the household. We also asked customers to rate who was benefiting more from their VPP participation, whether the aggregator was seen as benefiting more, whether the household was seen as benefiting more, or whether the aggregator and the household were benefiting about equally. And you can see here that we've got about double the customers indicating that the aggregator benefits more relative to the household benefits more. And we've got about 2/3 of participants or customers indicating that the aggregator and the household was benefiting about equally. Moving forward, it's going to be important to try to minimize the proportion of customers in that yellow band at the top. If you've got about 1/3 of customers who are indicating that the aggregator is benefiting more, that isn't a firm foundation for being able to have satisfying customers moving forward. And so having more people either sitting within the aggregator and household benefiting equally, or ideally as many people as possible in that household benefits more, is more likely to both drive customer retention and customer satisfaction. And I think will be an important element moving forward for the shaping up of value propositions, so that customers are more likely to see either that the benefits are being shared equally, or alternatively that the household is seen as benefiting more. We also looked at the extent to which DER and VPP adoption was seen as benefiting the household, the community, or the environment. And once again, we can see that from a VPP participation perspective, substantially fewer customers were seeing that the VPP participation had benefited their household relative to the adoption of DER. And this is, I think, again, speaking to the fact that additional work will be required to further sharpen up the value proposition for joining a VPP. If we have a look at some of those other dimensions, the environmental benefits for joining a DER was certainly being recognised by 88% 89% of customers, and we've also got very sizable proportions indicating that there are environmental benefits flowing through from joining a VPP as well. But for community benefits, smaller proportions were seeing that the community would benefit as a result of either their DER participation or through their VPP participation. So would customers remain? Despite all of those caveats and all of those elements that I was talking to, we still have a relatively sizable proportion of customers indicating a relatively strong likelihood of remaining with the VPP post the conclusion of the Project Edge trial. We've got 59% of customers, for example, indicating 8, 9, or 10 on a scale ranging from 0 to 10, where 0 is not at all likely to remain and 10 being very likely to remain. We've got 59% of customers indicating a high likelihood of remaining with their VPP post the conclusion of the Project Edge trial. We also asked customers to evaluate their likelihood of recommending either their DER or their VPP to other people. And broadly speaking, this allows us to generate the Net Promoter Score, or the NPS, which is a really commonly used industry metric for those that aren't currently familiar with it. It's a really common industry metric that allows us to compare how the customer's experience of the Project Edge VPPs stacks up with other equivalent VPPs within the Australian market. So in terms of the NPS scores and how they are determined, the NPS is looking at a likelihood scale where 0 equals not at all likely to recommend the product or service to others, and 10 being very likely to recommend the product or service to others. And people who rate 9 or 10 on that scale get classified as promoters. People who rate 7 or 8 on that scale get classified as passives, and people who rate 0 to 6 get rated as detractors. And we can see here that we've got 51% of customers were classified as being promoters of their VPP. In other words, they would be very likely to recommend that product or service to others. We've got 29% who were passives and 21% who were detractors. And NPS is calculated by subtracting the detractors from the promoters. So 51% minus 21% give us that NPS score of 30 for the Project Edge VPPs. I've put up here on the screen 2 comparison NPS scores. So we've got 11 as an NPS score for 7 Australian VPPs. And from memory, that was research conducted in 2021 or 2022. So very recent comparison, as well as also an NPS score of 65 for the Simply Energy VPPX. So broadly speaking, the experience that customers had with the Project Edge VPPs was both positive and also relatively comparable with other VPPs currently operating within the Australian market. We were also interested in understanding the extent to which customers might be motivated to engage in additional exports of power, particularly for those who had battery assets installed as a result of the trial. The first thing to note is that customers were not averse to increasing the amount of energy that they would export, so long as it provided or passed what I've described here as a better off overall test. There were a couple of elements to what would be identified as being better off overall. The first is that customers wanted assurances that if they were to engage in additional export activity, that it wouldn't unnaturally or accelerate the DER appreciation for what is effectively a very expensive asset that they've actually purchased. They wanted to make sure that the lifespan, the durability of their asset wouldn't be unnecessarily reduced as a result of engaging in that additional export activity. Customers were also wanting greater certainty about the financial implications associated with the exporting activity, such that if they were to export at certain points of time, that they would be able to make up financially what they would have lost potentially from having to draw down from the grid as opposed to draw down from their battery. So very much wanting to have certainty about what the financial implications of additional VPP exports would look like relative to what would have been the case if they had been relying exclusively upon self-consumption, whether directly from their solar panels or from stored energy in their battery. We also ask customers to evaluate the extent to which different strategies for motivating additional export activity would be or would not be motivating. And we've got 5 strategies up here on the screen that we presented to customers. I think the most important thing to recognise is that almost 50% of customers were evaluating these as being either very or extremely motivating. And so any one of those strategies would potentially be beneficial for motivating at least some customers for engaging in additional export activity. So those strategies would be providing better financial returns, providing customers with free DER maintenance, such as providing installation updates or getting up onto people's roofs and cleaning the solar panels on a regular basis, accessing stored power from other locations, which is the way that we frame this to customers was about accessing virtually the stored power that you've exported. If you have an EV, you're on the road and you're needing to recharge your EV, having more control over exporting, and also short-term requests provided by the aggregator to help others in an emergency situation. So all of these were seen as being potentially motivating by at least half of customers. But there was one strategy that was seen as being particularly motivating, and that was around the short-term philanthropically focused requests for additional export activity. Customers were seeing this as being a way of being able to tangibly help customers or others who might have been affected by droughts or bushfires, and where there is a need for additional power to be available to really help balance the grid in those types of situations. But something that was coming through the interviews that we did amongst customers from the same cohort of aggregators is that they wanted to also have a really tangible sense of what the impact had been of those philanthropic exports. They wanted it to be much more tangible than just tons of CO2 gases that had been displaced, because they couldn't necessarily tangibly appreciate what that would look like. They really wanted to have a clear sense of how their impacts or how their exports had really helped to benefit people within their local community. That being said, this focus around philanthropically focused exports didn't negate the need for exports to still pass that better off overall test. Customers wanted to have the assurance that if they were going to help others, they weren't putting themselves at relative disadvantage compared to if they hadn't engaged with that philanthropic request for additional exports. So that's a very high-level overview of some of the key findings emerging from the customer insights research we've undertaken. So what are the broad implications associated with this? I've tried to distill this down to a couple of key take-homes, at least from my perspective. The first is for aggregators and focusing particularly upon the value proposition. Potential customers were really expecting the VPP to save or to generate the money. And so with that in mind, it's really important from the perspective of developing an attractive value proposition to make sure that it can be as tangible as possible in terms of the financial benefits that it would start to deliver to customers. If that's what's really driving their interest, it's really important that there's associated and supporting information that can really paint that picture for potential customers. At the same time, both potential and current customers were struggling to see the personal benefits of joining a VPP over and above adopting DER, really demonstrating that additionality factor, what is required to make or to join a VPP over and above the adoption of DER, that's something that really needs to be either more effectively communicated to customers or alternatively better shaped up in terms of the value proposition for joining a VPP. Other elements of note are around communication and trust. Customers, and it didn't matter whether we're talking about potential customers or current customers, they're really looking for transparency from aggregators. They're really wanting to know what the potential financial implications are before joining, if we're talking about that potential customer cohort. And if we're talking about it for those who are current customers, really wanting to have information about how their DER assets are being used and really trying to link that VPP participation to financial benefits. And all customers were wanting to have those assurances around consumer safeguards, about the information that they would need to help make that decision to either join or to remain with the VPP, all of which had foundational to that issues of consumer safeguards, consumer well-being, and really having that transparency front and center. Aggregators that are able to provide customers with that sought after transparency are really well placed to develop up the desire of customers to have a trusting relationship with their aggregator. The other key challenge that aggregators will potentially face is really trying to balance out what needs to happen to ensure that customers, particularly current customers, have the information that they desire for transparency of how their DER assets are being utilised, balancing that up against the desire that a lot of customers had not to be involved in the day-to-day management of their VPP. And that's by no means an easy feat. I think that the balancing of that will require a degree of additional research to really delve into that trade-off more fully, but really trying to make sure that customers have the information as they desire it without being overwhelmed with information and overwhelmed with a huge amount of information input from their aggregator. Also, in terms of the motivation of additional exports, customers are not averse to potentially increasing the amount of power that they're exporting through the VPP, provided that it leaves them better off overall. And so there's a couple of broad strategies that could be used. As I mentioned a few slides ago, short-term irregular requests for additional VPP exports that are very much pitched around addressing an emergency need, ideally a local community emergency need, could very well motivate some customers to engage in philanthropically focused export activity. For more regular export requests, however, relational strategies that are seen as helping to deliver longer-term value for customers are likely to prove motivating, whether that be through the provision of better financial returns, through free DER maintenance, those types of things. From a policy perspective, customers were very much evaluating fairness through the prism of what would actually deliver the greatest benefits to their household for the least amount of cost. And I think that that's an important consideration to have when looking at issues of perceived fairness for any of these types of DER export policies. But of the DER export policies that we examined, the one that was deemed to be most fair by all customers was the one that involved no costly distribution upgrades and which also introduced dynamic export limits, primarily because there were no costly upgrades that any households would be having to shoulder, while at the same time also benefiting households with solar PV in being able to potentially increase the amount that they were exporting to the grid in certain periods of the day. In terms of future areas of research, because there is always issues that need further delving into, I've mapped out here on the screen 4 areas that I think are particularly important. The first one is, on the one hand, developing up value propositions that are seen to be equally attractive to potential and current customers, while on the other hand, also ensuring that they're financially sustainable for aggregators to operate. What is a viable business model for aggregators, in essence, that is also going to deliver tangible values and benefits that are seen as attractive to potential and current customers? There's more work that needs to be done in terms of identifying and delving into that in more detail. The second one, and something that I alluded to earlier in the webinar, is around the motivation for joining a VPP. What's more motivating? Presenting it as a standalone VPP offering and really looking at trying to make that as attractive as possible, or alternatively bundling a VPP so that it's offered as part of a broader package of services that might be able to deliver a broader bundle of benefits to customers. A third area where future research is required, it would be developing up algorithms that can help potential customers better understand what the potential financial implications will be associated with joining a VPP, so that we can really start to reduce that financial uncertainty that is currently plaguing some current customers in terms of understanding the extent to which they will be better or worse off as a result of joining a VPP. And then the final one, and the one that I've mentioned a couple of times throughout the webinar, is around how to most effectively communicating with customers and to being transparent in terms of how DER assets are being utilised, while at the same time respecting the fact that most customers aren't necessarily wanting to be involved in the day-to-day functioning of the VPP. So for knowledge sharing, I've gone through lots of different results emerging from our customer insights research, and there's a whole lot of other findings that have emerged from the Project Edge more broadly. And so I've put up here on the screen the website for those that are interested in delving more into any of those particular reports. As I've mentioned, I've also embedded throughout the webinar links to all of the reports that I've mentioned or alluded to, and so very much welcome you to go back, have a look at the webinar slides as they are released, click through the links as you're interested, and be able to delve into some of the findings in more detail. Finally, we are also presenting and finalising a summary report that captures much of what I've talked about in this webinar, but effectively is a standalone product, so that as people are interested in this over the coming years, there is a single snapshot that provides potentially a single entree into the broader package of customer insights research that we've done. And so just to give you a little bit of a sneak peek for what this will look like, it will be released over the coming weeks, but very much trying to have it as high level as possible, limited information as possible, but really trying to delve into the things that are the key learnings, the key elements that are particularly important to really understand. So for example, what were some of the research gaps that we identified? And then how does that actually start to translate to the findings that we generated? And you can see here, really tried to make sure it's as easy as possible for a person to be able to go through without having to wade through the hundreds of pages of technical reports that we've produced as a result of this particular set of research. If you've got any questions about anything that I've gone through, or would like to discuss about DERs or VPPs and those consumer-related issues more broadly, I've put my details up on the screen, and also a shout out to all the people from the Better Consumption Lab at Deakin University that were involved with the production of this research. It wouldn't have been possible without them. But finally, thank you very much for your patience as I've gone through the findings, and I will stop sharing my screen and happy to answer any questions that people may have. Jonathan.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for that. Yeah, great work. Really interesting to go through it all. Well, I'm sure not all. I'm sure there's much more, but a taste of it. One question I had was, you mentioned the survey of people's likelihood to continue with the VPP at the end of the EDGE trial. Is that associated with any change in the arrangements, any change in the benefits, or is it simply that they had, an initial period that's ending now and then a continuation, or is it just a natural attrition and drop off? Is there any particular sort of point at which they have to make a decision about that, just to put in context those results?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it was very much just wasn't a change in the benefits of the attributes being presented. It was just to effectively gauge if nothing else was to change, and if the VPP offerings that the aggregators had made available through Project Edge were to continue after the Project Edge trial concluded, to what extent would they be likely to want to remain with those VPP offerings? So hopefully that answers your question.
Cool. Yep.
Cool.
Thanks.
Perfect.
I might just add to that, Josh. Hi everyone, I'm Nick Regan. I'm the project lead from AEMO for Project Edge. One of the interesting, probably little bits to add on to that, Jonathan, is these customers were part of a field trial, and in that we had some periods that we were having aggregators coordinate their DER a lot more often than you'd expect ordinarily. So I think it's quite an interesting stat to see how many would want to continue and how high that net promoter score is, given they probably had a lot more of a hands-on treatment than you'd expect ordinarily. So just a interesting little bit to add there. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thanks, Nick. Terry, I see you've got your hand up as well.
Yeah, hi Josh. Thanks again for the presentation. Really good work. I wanted to sort of ask a bit of a tricky one in terms of notification of events. So I've been involved in previous trials of control where when you notified customers in advance, it pretty much guaranteed that you would get more complaints than if you didn't notify them, because it sets up like a subconscious bias. And you've said in there most customers actually didn't realise things were going on in the background with their control of their DER. Is there a way of testing for that? I know it would be very challenging. I mean, you'd have to probably potentially separate half the cohort and notify half and not notify the other half. I'm just, because it's a really important topic. We've been giving it lots of thought, and we kind of think, rather than be proactive, if the customer, we can be reactive to a customer. So if they're concerned that something's going on that they're not comfortable with, they can log onto their system, and we have an alert sitting on their screen that shows, yes, there's currently an event going on. So we don't pre-warn them, but there's communications if they have some concerns, like an easy way of I just don't know. Like, I think it's a really important issue to try and resolve.
Absolutely. And I think you've pretty much indicated the approach that I would be taking. First of all, A/B testing. So if you're really wanting to try to get as much science around this, to split out customers into two cohorts, half would be given those proactive messages. And for the other half, I would personally be doing exactly what you were just talking to, having the availability of information that people can either look at back at historically, or at least indicating that currently the DER asset is being utilized, because sometimes it's just the awareness that it's going to be flagged with you that can actually help from that transparency perspective. People might, without having direct, tangible, hands-on experience with a DER or a VPP, might be wanting to say, yep, give me all the information that I can possibly have, because that's going to give me transparency. But when they're actually faced with it in reality, they just want to know that if they were to turn to a particular area, if they had a particular question in their mind, that they would actually have something that they could help to resolve those potential questions in their mind. And so I think that that broader approach that you're currently going through probably would resonate for a sizable proportion. That being said, I'd always say test it, and doing some kind of A/B testing like what I just spoke to would certainly give you some firmer empirical results to draw upon.
Thanks.
And Mohsen, you've also got a question.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting. So I have two questions. The first one is kind of the basic question. How did you define the VPP for customers participating in the survey? I mean, there are different design elements for the VPP, who can join the VPP, what services VPP can provide. My first question is that what was the definition that you used for the customers participating in the survey? And the second question is related to the discussion that you had on actually different scenarios for export limit. And the second scenario was no grid upgrade plus dynamic export limit. Were there any particular question in that part related to different models that dynamic export limit can be employed? I mean, how customers think about different models of dynamic operating envelope that can be applied to them?
Yeah, great questions.
Thank you.
So in terms of the first one, the VPP was or the description of the VPP was very much based around a solar PV battery combination with the ability to be able to export stored power from the battery through the VPP, and with the aggregator being responsible for those battery exports. So that's sort of the VPP model that we were presenting to customers for those potential customers and for their perceptions. In terms of the policy perception, we didn't look at different forms of DOE. We were just effectively presenting them with a very broad sort of overview of DOE or dynamic export limits has been a possibility, and looking at how that would stack up relative to other potential policy options for allowing greater DER exports. But fully appreciate that there are complexities with how DOEs can be operationalized, and it's something that Nick and I have had a separate set of conversations around for what that might start to look like for issues of fairness, for example. So I think that that's, again, something that future research very much needs to be looking at to better understand, once you get into the weeds, what DOE models really resonate with customers and what are less likely to resonate.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Josh. We've also just got one question in the chat as well from Lisa. And the question was there any considerations of cultural demographics in any of the surveys?
Great question. And no, we didn't look at cold status, for example. We didn't look at any of those sort of broader culture-related factors, but certainly something that I think moving forward is important. And also probably issues of broader consumer vulnerability as well, because sometimes when we're looking at these types of issues, we automatically are focusing upon those that can afford these types of these types of technologies, but there's always the risk that we might be leaving important and vulnerable members of the community behind. And I think looking at those perceptions moving forward is also important.
That's perfect. I don't believe we see any other questions, so I think this is a perfect time to say.
just got a quick question. Sorry, it's
Oh,
not.
yep. Sorry.
It's actually Con Nutso from Red and Lumo Energy. I was just wondering, in terms of I was interested in obviously in the conclusion that that financial benefit is obviously critical. I was wondering whether, oh geez, I've just forgotten my question. I was just wondering whether, yeah, sorry, look, I've just forgotten that question. I'll just get back to you after the forum. Thanks. Yeah.
Very happy to have a follow-up conversation. Please
Yeah,
reach out.
sorry.
No, all good.
No, yeah, I have got it now. The value proposition. The value proposition aggregator, having an aggregator without having an aggregator, is that like using your own DER? Is that sort of just recovering a feed-in tariff versus, say, having an aggregator actually bid into the wholesale market at 5-minute intervals? Is that the value proposition?
Look, it's something. There are lots of different things that could go into developing up an attractive value proposition. I think probably even stepping back a little bit, a lot of customers aren't necessarily going to appreciate that there's that 5-minute bidding window. And so for that reason, they aren't necessarily going to attract or attach potential value to that as something that an aggregator can do, even though that could tangibly be an important value that an aggregator can actually provide to customers. And so it's partly going to be what is it that they perceive as being important. And I think because of a whole range of policy settings over the last few decades, feed-in tariffs, and given the way that so many people with solar panels are evaluating their DER assets through the lens of feed-in tariffs, is certainly an element of that. But there's also a whole lot of potentially intangible values that can also be provided. We're touching upon some of those with issues of CO2 emission reductions and community benefits. They didn't resonate as much. There will be some segments of the community for whom it does, but looking at the community as a whole, not resonating as much. But there'll be other things as well that could potentially go into developing up that attractive value proposition. Hopefully that answered your question. If not, happy to answer a follow-up or to have a separate chat about what this might look like.
All right, thanks. Yeah, great. Yep.
That's perfect. Do we have any last questions? I'm just aware I don't want to cut anyone else off, so sorry about that, Con. Perfect. Josh, I want to thank you very much for coming to speak to us all today about the Customer Insight Study. It's fantastic to see how the study has evolved over the different pieces of work that the Deakin team have done, and we really appreciate you drawing out all of those different insights and things like that. Just a reminder to everyone that in addition to all the reports, we have previously recorded presentations on each of the different segments that Josh has come to present on as well. And it's been such a rich and exciting piece of Project Edge, and we've been really happy and thankful for the work Deakin has done. So we thank you very much. And if you do have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to the Project Edge team or to the team at Deakin, and they'll more than happy to be able to answer those things as well. The presentation, as well as the final summary report that Josh mentioned, will be on the Project Edge site by the end of the week. So if you do have any other questions or any other issues, please let us know. But thank you so much, everybody, for your time as well. We really appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks very much, Josh. I think you and the team have really truly added to the knowledge base of what's a really key part of the DER integration journey, and that's making sure customers feel rewarded for having their DER used to benefit everybody else. So thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure. And thanks everyone for logging on to listen to the insights as well.
See you,
Bye,
everyone.
everybody. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thanks.
Thanks, Darren.